It is the only moment of Mark Carney's day that the UAE is allowing Canadian media to film as it restricts access. Behind closed doors before that, Carney met with the UAE's president and signed a new investment agreement.
It's part of his ongoing mission to reduce Canada's economic reliance on the United States.
Canada just made one of its boldest economic moves in years, and it happened far from Washington's shadow. Prime Minister Mark Carney has signed a major investment agreement with the President of the United Arab Emirates, opening the door to a new era of trade, capital flows, and strategic partnerships. And make no mistake, this is not just diplomacy. It is Canada declaring to the world that it will no longer allow Donald Trump's trade war to define its future. Carney arrived in Abu Dhabi this week with a clear purpose: to secure new partners as Canada accelerates its plan to double non-U.S. exports over the next decade. The visit included a tightly controlled tour of the Sheikh Zayed Grand Mosque, the only moment UAE officials allowed cameras to capture. Behind closed doors, however, real business was happening. Carney met privately with UAE President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. Together, they signed a new bilateral investment agreement, a treaty designed to protect and encourage foreign direct investment between the two countries. At the same time, both sides formally launched talks toward a Canada-UAE free trade agreement, something that no Canadian government had seriously pursued with the Gulf states until now. Carney's office says the pact will open doors for Canadian aerospace firms, engineering companies, agri-food exporters, and seafood producers. In return, the UAE signaled interest in investing in Canadian ports, mines, liquefied natural gas, critical minerals, and infrastructure, sectors Canada sees as essential for its long-term security and global competitiveness. The backdrop is undeniable. Donald Trump's second-term tariff campaign has driven Canadian exporters into a corner, with 10 to 100% U.S. border taxes hitting autos, steel, aluminum, and even food products. Reuters recently reported that Canada's exports to the U.S. have already dropped nearly 10 percentage points since 2024, the steepest decline in decades. Carney's response has been consistent: diversify or be dominated. As former Quebec Premier Jean Charest, now part of Carney's business delegation, told reporters, there's a bigger world out there than just the United States. And according to him, none of these agreements happen unless the Prime Minister personally leads the charge. For nearly 40 years, Canada has lived with a fundamental economic vulnerability. More than 75% of its exports flowed into a single market, the United States. When relations were stable, that dependency created comfort. But under Trump's renewed protectionism, it has turned into a strategic liability. The new UAE agreement is part of a broader Carney doctrine: build a global trade network that prevents any future American administration from holding Canada's economy hostage. Over the past 6 months, Carney has aggressively pushed deals across Asia, the Indo-Pacific, and now the Middle East. He met leaders in South Korea, Japan, Singapore, and Malaysia. He initiated a major ASEAN trade push. And last month, he announced internal reforms to eliminate interprovincial trade barriers by mid-2026, a structural fix long demanded by Canadian businesses to compete with U.S. scale advantages. Each move chips away at the old assumption that Canada must live at the mercy of American moods.
The UAE is not just another trading partner. It is one of the world's largest sovereign wealth investors, a country with deep capital surpluses and a hunger for stable democratic markets. For them, Canada is a perfect match: resource-rich, politically stable, and increasingly aligned with global clean energy demand. A bilateral investment treaty gives UAE investors the certainty they need to commit billions. For Canada, this money could accelerate LNG export terminals, northern deepwater ports, critical mineral extraction, and Arctic infrastructure, all areas where U.S. politics have slowed progress. According to reports in regional Gulf media, UAE officials have already signaled interest in large-scale investment in Canadian energy corridors and technology hubs. And unlike the US, the UAE is not demanding tariff concessions or political favors in return.
The timing is not accidental. Trump's second-term tariffs have created bottlenecks in North American supply chains, discouraged U.S. investment in Canada, and pushed firms like Stellantis and GM to relocate production south of the border. This has sparked backlash in Ottawa, where Carney's government now openly admits that dependence on the U.S. is no longer sustainable. Internationally, analysts are noting a trend. Canada is being pulled into a more multipolar trade world, where the U.S. is no longer the automatic center of gravity. The UAE deal reinforces that shift. It signals that Canada can attract partners even while the U.S. turns inward. It gives Canada new bargaining power in any future USMCA renegotiation. And it warns Washington that the era of unquestioned Canadian alignment may be ending. Trump's administration, meanwhile, has struggled to respond. While U.S. officials accuse allies of disloyal trade behavior, the reality is that Canada is reacting to U.S. aggression, not initiating it. Trump's tariffs created this diversification wave. Now he must live with the consequences.
There are, of course, risks. The UAE faces international scrutiny over allegations involving Sudan's conflict, though the UAE strongly denies involvement. Carney raised regional security concerns during the meeting, but his office did not disclose specifics. Still, the geopolitical complexity does not erase the strategic logic. Canada must expand its economic alliances at a moment when the U.S. is unpredictable, China is slowing economically, and Europe is overextended. The Middle East, especially the Gulf, offers something rare: capital, demand, and a willingness to engage without ideological baggage.
Canada's investment pact with the UAE is more than a trade story. It is a statement of intent. It tells the world that Canada is stepping into a new era of strategic confidence, willing to build alliances on its own terms, and determined to escape the gravitational pull of American politics. The question now is simple: will this be the beginning of a global Canadian commercial renaissance, or the first step into a more competitive, multipolar future where every partnership carries new risks? Viewers, what's your take? Is Canada finally standing tall on the global stage?
Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has announced that he will visit China in the new year following a bilateral meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the APEC Leaders Summit.
In Jeongju, South Korea, under the bright lights of the APEC 2025 summit, the cameras flashed as Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped onto the stage. His announcement was brief but historic. He would visit China in the new year. For most viewers, it seemed like another diplomatic headline. But to those who understood the currents of global politics, it was something deeper, a sign that Canada was quietly changing its place in the world. Carney's calm delivery masked a bold strategy. While President Donald Trump was using tariffs to pressure allies and rivals alike, Carney was opening a new door, not to challenge Washington directly, but to give Canada room to breathe. His upcoming visit to China, confirmed after a 40-minute private meeting with President Xi Jinping, marked what he called a turning point in Canada-China relations. For years, those ties had been frozen by diplomatic disputes, export bans, and public mistrust. Yet in that moment, Carney chose to shift from hesitation to engagement. It was the kind of move that separates a reactive government from a strategic one.
Carney's decision did not appear overnight. Since taking office, he has talked about re-anchoring Canada's economy to avoid overdependence on any single market. In his words at APEC, Canada's prosperity must rest on partnership and shared growth. That is not just rhetoric, it is a roadmap. The meeting in Jeongju revealed 3 layers of strategy. First, the economic layer. Canada's exports to China once exceeded $30 billion a year, but political frictions after 2018 cut deeply into that flow. The Ministry of Agriculture estimates that canola and meat producers alone lost more than $2 billion in sales between 2019 and 2022. Restoring that access could revive entire farming regions. The same logic applies to energy and clean technology. Canada holds world-class expertise in carbon capture, hydrogen, and advanced fuels, all of which align with China's domestic transition goals. Re-engagement means opening a market of 1.4 billion consumers to Canadian innovation. Second, the geopolitical layer. As the United States recalibrates its trade approach in Asia, allies from Japan to Australia have been forced to find their own balance between security and commerce. By re-entering dialogue with Beijing, Carney positioned Canada as a middle power that can bridge those divides rather than inherit them. Third, the leadership layer. Carney's background as a central banker shows in his patience and precision. He understands that credibility is built on consistency, not confrontation. The message he sent at APEC was subtle but unmistakable. Canada will pursue its national interest through conversation, not collision.
To grasp why this move stunned Washington, we need to look at timing. Just days before the APEC summit, Trump and Xi had announced a temporary trade truce. The United States agreed to lower its average tariff on Chinese goods from roughly 57% to 47% for 1 year, while Beijing paused its rare earth export controls and pledged to buy more U.S. soybeans. Financial Times and Reuters both reported that the deal calmed markets but left core disputes unresolved. That ceasefire created a diplomatic vacuum, a pause in the U.S.-China confrontation that no one expected Canada to fill. Yet Carney stepped in, not with grand speeches, but with quiet alignment. By meeting Xi Jinping immediately after the truce, he ensured Canada became the first Western nation to transform the new atmosphere into tangible cooperation. For Trump, who had spent 2 years framing global trade as a loyalty test, the optics were uncomfortable. While he used tariffs to isolate rivals, Carney used dialogue to integrate them. Instead of playing defense, Canada started shaping the conversation. It was also a move built on leverage. Canada's exports to the U.S. still account for about 75% of total trade, but China remains its second largest partner, worth over $100 billion in annual two-way commerce, according to Statistics Canada. Reopening that channel is not defiance, it is diversification, and it highlights a truth Washington often forgets. Allies act in their own interest when they are cornered. Carney's approach turned Trump's unilateralism into an opening for Canada. The U.S. president's focus on punishing trade left allies searching for options. Carney offered one. His message to the world was pragmatic, that engagement with China need not mean endorsement, and cooperation can exist without dependency.
The encounter, which both sides described as constructive, marks a significant moment in the gradual normalization of Canada-China relations after years of strained diplomatic ties.
At APEC 2025, every nation brought its own agenda. Japan focused on digital integration. South Korea sought energy partnerships. Australia pushed for supply chain resilience. Carney arrived with something different, a vision of reconnection. By confirming his upcoming visit to China, he placed Canada back into the Indo-Pacific conversation after years on the sidelines. The region now drives over 60% of global GDP growth, according to the International Monetary Fund. For an export-dependent nation, staying outside that engine is no longer viable. The cooperation areas already discussed, from agriculture to clean technology, fit squarely within APEC's 2025 agenda of inclusive and sustainable growth. Beyond economics, the symbolism is powerful. It signals that Canada can engage major powers on its own terms. That independence strengthens Ottawa's credibility with emerging markets, especially in ASEAN, where Canada is negotiating its first regional trade agreement. It also reassures voters that foreign policy is being guided by calculation, not by reaction to Washington's moods. In Asia, leaders value steady diplomacy. By keeping his tone practical and his objectives clear, Carney earned respect without provoking confrontation. His move aligned with Seoul's own balancing act, preserving alliances while broadening opportunity. For Canada, this turning point is more than ceremony. It is a test of endurance. The coming months will show whether words can evolve into tangible progress on trade and investment. Officials in both capitals are preparing working-level meetings to restore suspended agricultural certifications, align clean energy standards, and reopen consular channels for citizens abroad. These technical steps may seem routine, yet they mark the real beginning of normalization. Analysts describe this as pragmatic re-engagement, steady, measured, and focused on outcomes. It reflects Carney's governing style, deliberate, disciplined, and grounded in evidence rather than impulse. Meanwhile, Trump faces a different reality. His tariff strategy has driven prices higher and left U.S. farmers anxious. As Canada quietly builds new export routes and partnerships across Asia, the contrast grows clear. Carney chose patience where Trump chose pressure, and it worked. The meaning of this move extends beyond China. It represents Canada's emergence as a country that can engage the world without waiting for permission. If his 2026 visit to China unfolds as planned, it will be the first by a Canadian Prime Minister in years and a measure of whether this pragmatic path can deliver lasting results. In an era of loud politics, Carney's calm precision may prove to be Canada's strongest voice.
Leaders from every level of Canadian government are lashing out at Stellantis today. The automaker says it's reneging on plans to make Jeeps in Brampton, Ontario, and moving production to the U.S. instead.
The Prime Minister pushing back against Ontario's Premier, calling on him to get tougher on Donald Trump.
There's times to hit back and there's times to talk, and right now is the time to talk.
It began with one headline that shook both sides of the border. Stellantis, the parent company of Jeep, confirmed it would move production of its Compass model from Brampton, Ontario, to Illinois. The shift, worth roughly $13 billion in new U.S. investment, promised around 5,000 American jobs, but left 3,000 Canadian workers facing unemployment. For Washington, it looked like vindication. President Trump called it a win for American labor and proof that his aggressive tariff strategy was working. In the White House narrative, companies were finally coming home. But in Brampton, Ontario, the story felt very different. The mayor described the announcement as a punch to the gut for a city that had built cars for generations. Thousands of families now faced an uncertain future, while the local economy braced for the loss of wages, suppliers, and community support. Behind the emotion lay a deeper reality. Trump's tariffs, 25% on most Canadian goods and 10% on energy, had rewritten the economics of cross-border production. Stellantis was responding to pressure, not opportunity. The policy that aimed to protect U.S. manufacturing was forcing North America's most integrated industry to tear itself apart. And yet, amid the anger, Canada's national government stayed calm. Prime Minister Mark Carney did not call for revenge. Instead, he delivered one quiet message that defined the country's tone. Now is a time to talk.
Across Canada, frustration boiled over. In Brampton, local unions warned that the Stellantis move could trigger a domino effect, with other automakers reconsidering their Canadian operations. Auto parts suppliers feared they might follow the same path south, taking thousands of indirect jobs with them. Patrick Brown, the city's mayor, urged Ottawa to restore the retaliatory tariffs that had been lifted earlier in the year. He reminded reporters that both the federal and Ontario governments had invested heavily in retooling Stellantis' plants in 2022. Workers wondered whether that public money was now lost. Economically, the shock rippled outward. Data from Statistics Canada showed that automotive exports had already fallen by 9% between January and September 2025. The decline was steepest in Ontario, where steel and aluminum shipments had slowed after new U.S. duties took effect in February. Even industries outside autos, furniture, timber, and building materials were feeling the squeeze. Yet the impact in the United States was not as straightforward as the headline suggested. Higher tariffs had raised costs for American builders, and shipping data from the Port of Los Angeles in September showed a 12% slowdown in furniture and cabinet imports because of overlapping duties.
In other words, the supposed victory for U.S. industry was also tightening pressure on its own consumers. In Canada, the anger was political but also strategic. Many provincial leaders wanted to fight back, to match tariffs with tariffs. But Ottawa hesitated. The Prime Minister's office believed that a loud response could escalate a trade war at the exact moment Canada needed stability. Instead of retaliating, Carney's government focused on what it called re-anchoring supply chains, supporting domestic sectors quietly while keeping diplomatic doors open.
So the strategy has to take all of that into account and deliver the results. We start from a position where we have a better deal than any other country in the world with the United States. 85% of our trade is free. The deals the Americans have signed with everyone else has tariffs on the core of the trade, and then higher tariffs on the strategic sectors. So we're starting from this stronger position.
When Carney finally appeared before reporters, his tone was measured. He acknowledged the pain in Ontario, but insisted that restraint was not weakness. Canada, he said, was already engaged in intensive negotiations with Washington across several key industries: energy, aluminum, steel, forestry, and autos. He planned to brief Ontario Premier Doug Ford on progress in those talks. Carney's broader message was that trade policy could not be managed through emotion. The country, he argued, must prepare for the upcoming USMCA review in 2026, when every clause of the North American Trade Agreement would be reassessed. Acting rashly now could jeopardize that process. He reminded Canadians that their country still enjoyed the best access to the U.S. market of any nation on Earth. According to data from the Department of Global Affairs, roughly 85% of Canada's exports enter the United States duty-free. By contrast, America's recent deals with the European Union, Japan, and South Korea all included tariff floors on major goods. Canada's existing framework, though strained, remained uniquely favorable. Carney's approach contrasted sharply with the rhetoric from local leaders. Where they saw betrayal, he saw leverage. His goal was to keep negotiations alive until the United States itself faced pressure to compromise, from rising prices, disrupted parts supplies, and a restless manufacturing base that relied on Canadian inputs. There are times to hit back and times to talk, he said. Right now is the time to talk. For Carney, dialogue was not surrender, it was positioning, a way to ensure that when the next round of trade talks begins, Canada still has cards left to play. As the weeks passed, the meaning of that restraint became clearer. Canada began to redirect its focus inward and outward at the same time. Provinces like Nova Scotia accelerated resource projects, fast-tracking exploration for lithium and other critical minerals. Federal agencies pushed investment toward domestic steel and battery component plants to keep the sector alive. Abroad, Ottawa intensified ties with partners outside Washington's orbit. Negotiations advanced with the European Union on expanding their clean energy framework, while trade missions to Japan and South Korea explored supply chain cooperation independent of U.S. oversight. Canada was no longer waiting for permission to act. Meanwhile, the United States faced growing logistical strain. Tariffs that once looked like a shield now acted like a tax on its own system. Auto analysts at S&P Global noted in an October 2025 report that vehicle assembly costs in the Midwest had risen nearly 14% year over year due to higher input prices and transport delays. The reshoring push was creating bottlenecks, not efficiency. Trump's claim of victory over Canada now looked less certain. The Stellantis move symbolized a political win, but economically, it revealed a fragile reality. Protectionism cannot isolate an integrated market without breaking its rhythm. Every action to weaken a partner risks weakening the network itself. For Canada, the road ahead remains difficult. Jobs have been lost, and communities like Brampton are still reeling. But Carney's decision to pause, to talk instead of retaliate, may define a new phase in the relationship. His message is pragmatic, that power in trade is not just about who strikes first, but who endures long enough to shape the outcome.
The Stellantis episode was supposed to prove Trump's strength. Instead, it exposed how deeply connected North America's economies remain, and how a single tariff meant to punish can end up redrawing alliances, reshaping industries, and reminding the world that sometimes the quiet response is the most strategic one of all.
Looking around the world now, you've got China sort of playing by its own playbook economically. You have the U.S. playing by its own playbook, ignoring various agreements, including at times USMCA. What does that mean for the rules-based system for a middle power like Canada?
At the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered a message that left many in Washington unsettled.
And nobody's perfect in this. We have a free trade agreement with the European Union. And we're re-engaging with China and other major economies in terms of developing the rules bilaterally with them.
He announced that Canada would re-engage with China, seeking to establish a new framework for bilateral rules. This declaration landed just as the United States, under President Trump, has extended its reciprocal tariff regime to every major trading partner, including Canada. The tariffs were meant to force others into accepting America's terms. Yet Carney signaled that Canada was ready to chart its own path. Instead of bowing to pressure, Ottawa is turning outward, searching for new alliances and new leverage. The story begins with a clash of visions. Trump builds walls of tariffs. Carney opens doors to alternative partners. That contrast sets the stage for what comes next.
Carney made clear that both Washington and Beijing are playing by their own rulebooks. For Canada, that reality means waiting for others to return to multilateral discipline is no longer an option. Ottawa will now attempt to develop direct rules with China, recognizing the risks but also the opportunities of engaging the world's second-largest economy. Sensitive areas such as national security and data privacy will remain closed. Yet Canada intends to carve out a controlled space for trade and cooperation. This is not surrender, but calculation. With Trump escalating confrontation and tariffs disrupting steel, autos, and farm products, Carney has decided that Canada must place a chip on every table. The re-engagement with China is meant to give Ottawa more balance and more say, even if it means moving in a direction opposite to Washington. This step is designed to give Canada breathing room at a time when U.S. trade actions are tightening around all partners. Carney also reminded his audience that Canada already holds positions in two of the world's largest rules-based systems, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, known as CPTPP, and the Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement. These agreements include standards for labor and sustainability, the kind of provisions that are recognizable and enforceable. By being part of both, Ottawa can serve as a bridge between Europe and Asia. The United States, by contrast, has stepped away. Trump pulled America out of the original TPP and has repeatedly ignored commitments under USMCA. Carney's point was not hidden. Canada is investing in systems where rules matter, while Washington sidelines itself. As those networks expand, America risks becoming the bystander. Ottawa is signaling that its future will not be locked inside Trump's tariff cage. Instead, Canada is building the kind of international bridges that leave Washington outside the room when new rules are written. Carney did not deny Canada's vulnerability. Nearly 80% of Canadian trade still flows south into the United States. But he emphasized the importance of what he called the growth at the margin. New trade with Europe, with CPTPP countries, and with China can shift the balance over time. Even small increases in those directions can change the outlook for industries battered by tariffs. Trump's reciprocal tariffs, meant to squeeze, are creating the incentive for Canada to move elsewhere. The backfire is clear. Instead of reinforcing dependence, the policy has accelerated diversification. Canada is showing that it can step out of America's shadow and place itself in the center of a different global map.
The contrast could not be sharper. Trump designed his tariff regime to keep Canada in line, but Carney's new approach flips that logic. By re-engaging with China and doubling down on Europe and Asia, Ottawa is no longer asking Washington for permission. Canada is signaling that it has options and that the United States is not the only game in town. This is the image that left Trump stunned, watching as his neighbor quietly walked out of the cage he built. That is why Carney's words in New York carried such weight. Trump sought to lock Canada in. Ottawa has walked out, leaving the U.S. president stunned as his northern neighbor rewrites the script of survival and influence.